All right, so it's my pleasure tonight to have Adina Moulton lead our session on finances and grant writing. So Adina is actually currently doing her supervised practice of ministry with me at Presbytery. And she's in her final year at Yale Divinity School. And I'm going to let her introduce herself as well. But before that, part of the reason we asked her to do this workshop is her career before that was doing grant work for the Digital Harbor Foundation in Baltimore. And so this is an area that she knows inside and out. And so we're really, really excited to have her here with us tonight. And so with that, I'm going to invite, as my son comes into the room, I'm going to mute myself to invite, and he knows Miss Adina.
He wants to talk to Miss Adina.
I'm going to let Adina introduce herself. Okay.
Good evening, everyone. It is grateful to see and or meet you. As Jennifer said, I am a intern currently doing my supervised ministry at Baltimore Presbytery, thinking a lot about church finances, and have been working in the nonprofit sector, working on grants and then some nonprofit management for 6 years now. So this is something that is a subject that has become near and dear to my heart. It was very much not the case before then, but it's something that I've become really passionate about, and I think is a really important topic to discuss in church context specifically. So I'm going to share my screen. So a handy little presentation here. We'll get to, there we go. Can folks see all that good stuff? Jennifer, yeah, great. Okay. There we go. So I want to start, as Jennifer said, this will be a workshop that goes over both the very basics of budgeting, specifically budgeting and church contexts, as well as the high level kind of like 101 view of applying for grants. I should also say that I have sat where all of you are sitting or have sat in the past. I was also an elder at DMPC. My term ended in December of this year. So I bring that with me as well. And so because we are Presbyterians and we are, talking about how to incorporate these financial topics into church, I wanted to start with a theological reflection. And this is from Matthew 6, verses 19 to 21. And it says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." So I heard this verse a lot growing up as a kid. You may have as well. And the way that I interpreted it for most of my life is that it is bad, maybe even sinful, to think about or talk about money. Because if you're thinking about or talking about money, then you clearly are not worried about the kingdom of God. You're worried about the wrong things. But what I have learned, particularly in my career and as an elder on session, is that the way that we can honor God is by taking seriously the resources that have been given to us. For better or worse, we live in an economy that is based on money. And what I have noticed is that when we don't think about and talk about money, that money can end up doing things that we didn't realize it was doing, and actually pulling us away from the relationship that we want to have with God, that we want our churches to have with God. And that and the work that we see God calling us to do in the world. So I propose to you today, and if anything, if you take nothing else away from this webinar, I invite you to ponder this, to think about talking about money and thinking about money in church context as an act of faithfulness, as an act of love, and as an act of justice. Because when we ignore this topic, we both ignore the good and the bad that money can do. So with that, my screen will let me move. There we go. So we're going to start off with church budgets. This will be a review for some of you, but I wanted to start by just laying out some baseline principles of budgeting in churches. First of all, why do budgets matter? This is part of where a community-wide anxiety around talking about money, I think, manifests itself, where both in churches and out of churches, with friends, with family, and nonprofits, even with nonprofits, like even with fundraisers and executive directors leading nonprofits, people get really anxious about talking about money, and so they don't like to talk about their budgets either. But when we think about budgeting faithfully and as an act of discipleship, what it allows us to do is to reflect on and clarify the congregation's priorities and the sense of call. And it invites a period of reflection for the session, for the church staff, for the congregation members, to see if the things that they really want to do and that they really care about actually match with what the church is spending its time and money on. So if the church has expressed a passionate call for addressing housing insecurity, for example, but there's no money going towards addressing housing insecurity in the budget, that's an opportunity when the next budget cycle comes around for the church to say, okay, if this is one of our priorities, how do we make sure that our priority is getting the resources it deserves to make the difference we want it to make in the world? I just realized, did my camera go off? Okay, perfect. Another reason why budgeting really matters is that budgets allow members who are donating to the church to understand where their money is going. This is both shows respect and care and concern for the members who are donating their resources to the church. Sometimes at great personal sacrifice. It also is something that is especially important to younger members who are donating to churches. We have seen in giving trends, different generations care about different things in terms of like how they donate money, and younger people in particular really want to know where their money is going and how it's being spent. So this is also just the best practice in promoting strong fundraising. And then the third reason I want to highlight is that it facilitates responsible financial stewardship. If we don't know where our money is supposed to go, we can't realize when something goes wrong. And Jennifer actually agreed to share a brief story of what can happen when things go wrong.
So there is a story of a church that it's not just about their budget, but about financial reports. And this gets to the importance of having regular financial reports at session meetings. So ensuring that you're reviewing what is going on with your finances in relationship to your budget every time you meet as a session. There is a story of a church where that was not happening on a regular basis. And there was a new person who was in a position where it was a new administrator, and they were in a position where they were also the ones who were approving payroll. And they started to embezzle money from the church through the payroll system. And over the course of the months where the church was not checking was not getting regular financial reports, this person was able to embezzle $35,000. So this is to say, budgets are really important, and then knowing your budget is also really important, which means, a session reviewing your budget next to what is being spent every month.
Thank you, Jennifer. So now that we've discussed why budgets matter, let's talk about some budget writing process best practices. So I want to start by saying, if you give yourself enough time to write a budget, then you'll be able to put all of the thought that can really allow you to maximize your budget for the rest of the year. Have it be a tool that your congregation and your session and your pastoral leadership team are able to go back to again and again, rather than just ending up in a proverbial drawer and being forgotten about until the next budget year. So I recommend giving yourself at least 3 months before the end of your budget year. So if your budget year ends on December 31st, starting in September, if it ends in June, beginning in March, like that. That way you have time to make the process collaborative. Budgets are only helpful as a tool to show what the entire congregation cares about and is thinking about if the entire congregation is involved in some way, primarily through the session, in determining what is actually going into the budget. And that builds cohesion, that builds trust, that builds a sense of community across the entire congregation. And then the easiest way to go about making a budget is to look at previous budgets, not just what you have budgeted, but then the money you actually brought in. And when you're actually assigning new numbers, both to income and expenses, a good rule of thumb is to be conservative in your estimates of how much money you're going to be bringing in, and generous in your estimate of what your expenses are going to be, so that you're essentially able to plan for the absolute worst happening. Now, this doesn't mean that you should deliberately go to the extreme on either of those. So you shouldn't estimate tens of thousands of dollars less than you'll make, and you shouldn't add another $50,000 of expenses just to feel like you've padded your budget enough. But being on the upper end of what could go wrong realistically will give your church the durability to handle when problems come up. Another one that is something I see a lot in both the nonprofit and sometimes in the church space as well, is how many lines are actually in your budget. So it's important to have enough line items to actually accurately reflect all the money that's coming in, and the different types of money that's coming in, and all the money that's going out, and the different types of expenses the church is accruing. So you want to have enough categories so that you can see with a good level of detail what is happening in the church, so that mistakes and sometimes bad actors aren't able to slip through the cracks. That said, when there's a line item for every single thing in your official budget, that makes it really hard to read. And it particularly makes it very hard for funders to read. And so when these budgets start getting sent out to people who don't know the church inside and out, if there are a lot of line items that can be, that you can only really know or understand if you're in the church itself, it makes it hard for people outside of the church to know what's going on. And then last of all, as Jennifer explained why this is so important, don't approve a budget and then never look at it again. That means you've just wasted your time. And it also means that it means losing out on a valuable opportunity to have a milestone, essentially, to use to compare how your church is doing and how it's faring throughout the year, so that you don't get any nasty surprises or miss any new and exciting opportunities that may emerge as the year progresses. So I have here a simple view of what a one way that a budget might look, just to kind of illustrate what I am talking about. So this is looking at revenue line items. And so you have here, just as an example, and not all of these line items would be necessarily relevant to your church, individual contributions. So that would be things like pledges, one-time donations, plate offerings, grant revenue, which we'll be talking about, events income. So if people are paying to attend a raffle, that kind of thing. Endowment or investments, if the church has an endowment or investment and is receiving income from. Earned revenue. So this would be the kind of thing if you have a coffee shop attached to your church, for example, and you're getting in revenue that is closer to a business, or rental income is something that a lot of churches are either doing or exploring. That would fit into earned revenue. And then miscellaneous revenue. It's always nice to have a miscellaneous category if there's something that just really doesn't make sense. And so it's as I've listed like different subcategories within a lot of these, I do want to say it's totally fine to have subcategories within each of these in your budget itself. But it is very helpful to have all of those numbers roll up into or add up into a single line item. So looking at individual contributions, for example, you might have 3 sub-line items that say plate offerings and pledges and one-time gifts. But then those all can add up to individual contributions so that when you're sending this budget out to people, they don't have to get into the weeds. Okay. And then there's several different ways to document expenses in the budget. I've just pulled out 2 for comparison. One is by creating a budget based on the type of expense that you have. And so this is just literally thinking about what are all the things we spend money on, categorizing them, assigning a cost to them. In comparison, some organizations prefer to break out their budgets by the type of program that they are running. So in a church, for example, you might have a worship budget. And so all of the materials costs and the travel costs and the food costs for the entire worship program would be its own line item. Whereas in a budget that is where expenses are tracked by type, all of the food for all of the programs would be in one line item. All of the materials for all of the programs would be in another line item. Okay, and I want to pause here to see if folks have a couple of burning questions. And I can't, Jennifer, if you can see if people are raising their hands since I can't see screens.
I think we're good to go on.
Perfect. And then there will be another time for questions at the very end of this. So if something comes up, never fear, there is more time to talk through things. Okay, grants. This is my, how I earn my living. So I'm passionate about grants. So what is a grant? It's I think a really important question, and not something that is necessarily self-evident. So a technical definition that I like comes from the Council of Foundations, that defines a grant as an award of money from one organization to another to undertake charitable activities. Essentially, money is going from one organization to another organization, or sometimes an individual, for them to do good work. Usually a grant is awarded after some kind of application process. This is a really key difference between a grant and an individual donation. Someone might give you an individual donation after coming to your church a few times, maybe meeting with your pastor and learning about the different kinds of programs, and then they write a check and give it to you. In a grant, all those things might happen, but then the representative from the granting organization would say, hey, can you write a 2 to 5 page document telling me what you'd want to do with any money I gave you? And then You submit that document, they read it, and they decide whether to fund you or not. And along with that, grants almost always have specific rules about how the funds are used, and or they have reporting requirements that where you have to say how you spent your money and what came of the program, of what you spent your money on. This is, again, a really, really key difference. Usually individual donations, when people write a pledge, fill out a pledge card to the church, they aren't generally saying all this money has to go to worship or all of this money has to go to Christian education. Most of the time, grants do have that level of specificity where they're only funding a single project. If, for example, let's say the Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation, which is a very famous foundation in Baltimore, were to give you $50,000 for Christian education, that's very exciting, it's amazing. The next day, your roof falls in. You can't touch a dime of that $50,000 to fix the roof because that's not what the Weinberg Foundation said you could spend it on. So it's really, really important. So there are benefits and drawbacks of grants, and I think this is an important thing to keep in mind as more and more churches are thinking about making grants writing a key part of their fundraising plan. So the benefits. So grants are ways to secure a lot of money from a single source or person. And having that influx of cash makes life a lot easier than relying on small donations over and over and over again. Grant funders are also potentially more likely than an individual, individuals in a congregation to be excited about a large or risky project. So perhaps this is a large project like renovating the church building. A single funder could come in and give you the $150,000, $200,000 to fund that entire process, which is much less time consuming than running an entire capital campaign that relies just on church donations. Or perhaps you want to try a really interesting new worship style, but you need some startup funding, essentially. You might be able to find a grant funder that is willing to take a risk, essentially. And then this also diversifies revenue. So if you're a church that relies entirely on individual donations, it can be really helpful to augment that with with grants, so that if for whatever reason individual giving goes down, you have other sources of revenue to draw on. But there are some drawbacks as well. So grant writing is time intensive. Lots of people do it full time and overtime, if I'm honest, because it takes a lot of time and it takes practice to write a good grant. As I've mentioned before, there are restrictions on how funds are spent. So you can't just mix the money with all the other types of money that are coming in, and that takes some getting used to. And because you have to provide very specific reports on how very specific amounts of money were spent, if grant writing becomes a major part of your fundraising strategy in particular, it will become very important to add additional measures for financial and programmatic tracking. So you may need to set up new accounts, for example, that only hold grant funds, so you can be absolutely sure that that money is going where it needs to go. You'll need to perhaps pay greater attention to the number of people who are attending events. For example, if they are grant funded, you'll need to write up in a report how many people came to all of your Christian education events that were funded by a funder in a year. And so that takes time, and is something that is very, very hard to look back and try and figure out. That's something I've had to do many a times, trying to retroactively imagine or like sleuth, like Sherlock Holmes, what actually happened in the program, and it is painful for everyone involved. And then something that I want to raise in this context specifically is that many funders do not fund religious organizations, or if they do, they only fund activities that don't have a religious aspect to them. So, and this is for lots of reasons. Excuse me 1 minute. This is for lots of reasons. Some funders don't want to seem partisan. Some funders don't want to deal with the slightly different tax status that churches have. So there are lots of reasons for this, and so it's just an important thing to keep an eye on. So we have discerned together as a congregation or as a session that grant writing is a good step forward for us. What do? So to submit a grant application, we of course need to identify potential grants. There are lots of places to go to do this. If you are just starting out, I would actually recommend going to the websites of denominations and other religious organizations that you already know about and see what's already out there. So things like the Baltimore Presbytery website, things like the other websites of other entities in the PCUSA. There are also often newsletters and databases you can sign up for. Databases tend to charge a fee, so it might make sense for, for example, a couple of churches to band together and go in on a single database subscription. A lot can be done with some determined Googling. So if you type in literally grants for religious organizations in Maryland, you'll get more responses than you realize. It takes some patience, but it does work. And then I can't overestimate the value of word of mouth. Talking to each other, talking to folks at the presbytery, talking to just your friends and neighbors, especially if they're in the nonprofit community, is a really good way to figure out what kind of funding is out there. Okay, so you found a grant that you are really excited about. You then read the grant requirements to see if the funder's priorities align with your work. Funders, for example, might be really focused just on working with churches in the Washington, D.C. metro area. It doesn't really make sense for you to apply for a grant if you're in Baltimore City, if the funder only gives to Washington, D.C. specifically. This is something that it can be really tempting to say, oh, but maybe I'll be an exception. You probably won't be. And so, again, honestly, don't waste your time and focus on things that are more likely to be a return on your investment. And then check again to see if the church is eligible to receive the grants. And this is again thinking about things like geography, but then also does the grant maker fund religious organizations? Okay, so you've checked the requirements. Amazing. They all fit what they all match between what the funder wants to do and what you want to do. You are eligible. You go and you write the application. And some applications are pretty short. It's essentially a Google form. Some are much longer. So I've written applications that once all the documents are put together were over 100 pages long. And so that is something that is also worth thinking through. Is the amount of effort and the amount of time I am going to spend writing this grant worth the amount of money that I get for it? That the 100-page application got my organization over $1 million. So we decided that makes sense. But there have been times we've been asked to write, 15-page applications for $5,000. That doesn't make sense. So we let that go. And when you're writing the application, the most important thing is to show how the work that you are doing aligns with what the funder cares about. It can be really easy to see in your head how you and the funder match, but sort of like how you hear that employers only look at a resume for 30 seconds, funders spend as little time reading these applications as possible very often. So it's very helpful to use language that makes it really clear that you know this funder's organization. So using the exact kinds of words and phrases and terms that are in the funder's website and in their application information can be a really good way of signaling that you know who they are and you care about the same things they care about. And then finally, many applications, if not most, require other documents in addition to a written narrative, particularly a budget, often your church's entire organizational budget, as well as a budget that's just for that program. So if you're running a grant for Christian education, you'll probably need to submit your church's total grant and then a budget for just the Christian education program. So some things to watch out for. These are all mistakes either I have made or people around me have made, and they hurt. So do not do what we did. The first is a term that's called dollar chasing. And so the way dollar chasing usually happens is there is a funder you think is really cool, or frankly, you're feeling really anxious about the financial situation of your church or your nonprofit. And so you are just willing to apply for anything and everything under the sun. And so, yeah, you'll have to create an entirely new program to apply to get this funding. And yeah, no one actually knows what this program would look like in real life, but we're going to get like $50,000. So it's worth it, isn't it? It's not. That is the devil on your proverbial shoulder talking. Because what happens when you dollar chase is your organization loses a sense of who it is. Thinking again about money from a theological and justice perspective. When you're looking for money just to find money and just to feel more comfortable with where your church is, it's harder to follow the specific sense of call that your church has discerned together that you want to work towards. Similarly, securing a grant for a project the congregation is not invested in. So I have a friend who her church was struggling financially, but the pastor decided they really, really, really needed a youth director. The church didn't really want a youth director. There were like 5 youth in the congregation, but the pastor basically forced the church to do it. Then the pastor left and the church said, "Hey, Grace, we love you, but we don't want you to really do this anymore because we never did." Fortunately, Grace's position, my friend's position, wasn't grant funded. And so that meant that she could move around and do something different. But if my friend's salary had come from a grant, she would have been forced essentially to continue running a youth program that no one wanted, and wasting everyone's time and ultimately the church's money. Third is when the church lacks the financial capacity to administer a grant. This is frankly where you can start getting into some shaky ethical territory, where you may not be able to honestly and faithfully say that you know where the funder's money went. And that is a gross and a scary place to be. And then accepting funds from organizations that contradict your church's values. I came across a grant program at a museum a year or so ago, and the grant program was focused on promoting technological innovation to address the climate crisis. That's super cool. That's awesome. I looked a little bit closer and saw that the program itself was funded by a major oil company. So this museum that was doing really great work was hitching its wagon, so to speak, with the type of organization that was actively undermining its work. And I think it's really important for us all to remember that grant funders, a lot of the time, even most of the time, are doing this work because they care about it and they want to make the world a better place. But when you receive funding from a grant, you are endorsing the person or the institution that money came from. And so if that person or that institution stands for things that go against what you believe, God is calling your church to do and to be, I would think carefully before applying. Okay, you got the grant. Excellent. Now what? I have talked about this a couple of different ways, but I'm going to say it one more time. It's incredibly important to be aware of any restrictions that exist around how funds are used. You can't use money. You can't use the money for anything else. And it sucks and it's obnoxious, but that is how it is. And be sure that you understand both the financial requirements, what are the kinds of forms that you will need to fill out at the end of the grant period, and the programmatic reporting requirements. Will the funder want to know how many people you served? Will they want to know what specific renovations you made to the building? Know that ahead of time so that you can be capturing all of that information as you go along, instead of having to do, again, a mad dash through every person's email and every person's camera reel to see if they can get any good photos. And at the very end, trying to cobble together a report. And so a report for a grant a grant program is usually due 6 to 12 months after the initial award was made. So I really recommend putting in a Google alert in your calendar, writing it in your planner, however you keep track of dates. Mark that as soon as you get the grant so that you don't have any nasty emails waiting for you one Monday morning asking why you haven't reported on a grant. Okay, and then I want to end by thinking about how do we reflect grants and grant funding in church budgets. The big thing I want to emphasize is that you probably will not get all or even most of the grants that you apply for. And so it is really important that if you say, okay, we are going to apply for $50,000 worth of grants, you should not put in your, say that you'll get $50,000 of grant income in your budget. You shouldn't count on any single grants in your budget unless the church has consistently received that grant in the past, I'd say for at least 2 years in a row. And or you've already been in communication with that funder and you know that they're going to give you a grant award. Unless you have that level of certainty, don't rely on any one grant to make up your grant budget. And so if you're saying, well, we're trying a new thing, we haven't really gotten grants before, but we want to show what grant revenue would look like in the budget. I usually recommend applying for 3 to 4 times as much revenue as you want to include in your budget. So if you want to have a line item that says you're going to get $25,000 in grant revenue, apply for $75,000 to $100,000 worth of revenue. That is it. That was a lot, I know. So I'm curious if folks have any questions. I should say as well, go.
I have a question. Thank you very much. It was a good overview. I would just be interested in knowing some of the other people here tonight sharing what they've sought grants for, what programs, what developments they were looking for.
This is Lisa Hayes at Dickey Memorial. We recently renovated our manse, which needed quite a bit of work, and so, well, with that money actually came out of an endowment, but it was, to be honest, similar to requesting a grant. We had to provide a lot of information about, what we were doing, what our bigger plan was, what our current plan, the immediate plan for the manse, how the money was going to be spent. So, we were fortunate to get that grant. Fortunately, it was before the market crashed and, things got tight financially, which helped. We are also in the process slowly, very, very slowly because of time constraints, working with or trying to get grants written for some landscaping work we're doing. We have stormwater management issues, and there are grants through the Chesapeake Bay Trust. We are part of the Interfaith Partnership group that has a green team. I don't know if you're familiar with that, and so there are grants sort of in connection with that. And there's small grants and there's big grants. And what I was told, because I've been looking into, whether we need to get somebody to help us do some of this grant writing and fundraising, is that a lot of these places do expect you to, that you can write the grants yourselves. And then these organizations like the Interfaith Partnership group will help you review the grant and give you advice, or other people at other churches. Some earlier grants that we did apply for church, Adina obviously was wonderful because she was on the session and could review them. Because we did apply for an historic congregation one too. I forgot about that, which we did not get.
Thank you. That was helpful.
Mel?
So let me ask about having
so-
someone either on session or someone in the church that's a member of the family or community that is a writer, a grant writer. Would it be wise for us to have a relationship with someone that can take on the responsibility of writing grants as we need them?
That's a really good question. I think it depends on the church, which is a frustrating answer. But it depends on the extent to which the session wants grant making and grant writing to be a major part of its fundraising plan. As Lisa said, there are a lot of kind of one-off types of grants that are available that I would say like a passionate, determined I guess newbie would be totally fine writing. If, however, you're saying, no, we want to bringing in tens of thousands of dollars every single year in grants, that's when you'd really want to contract out with someone who has experience in that. I saw Mel and Adrian's hands. So Mel, do you want to go first?
Okay. It's Mel, Dickey Memorial, and I am not on session at the moment, but I have always been wondering about something like the problem that we have with our elevator. And it is, it's important to me because I once was a person who was incapacitated enough that I needed a power wheelchair. And the church that I was going to at the time actually built a concrete ramp to get up into the church. It was extremely expensive. And I'm not talking about using that kind of money, but is there a way to look for, I mean, would you say to find a grant that might help with that? Would you say, I want grants that help small churches rebuild their elevators, or how would you even go to find something like that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think what I'm hearing you ask about, Mel, is this question of alignment. How do you find the types of funders who care about the same thing and are giving money to the same things that you care about? So one thing that, was embedded in your story, Mel, and thank you so much for sharing it, is the importance of accessibility and access. And so that is something that a lot of funders are thinking about. So looking for grants that are focused on increasing accessibility, I think would be, the first place I would start. There probably are grants out there that are talking specifically about what's called capital improvements, and that's talking about fixing or building infrastructure, building buildings. I'm suspect, I do not know, but that there are definitely grants out there that are focused specifically on raising money for either churches or other organizations to make their buildings more accessible. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Adrian.
Your first question was, no, it was Anne, I believe, that asked about some grants. And Lisa, we did apply for the Interfaith Partner of the Chesapeake Grant, and we received almost $5,000 to put our garden in front of our church. And Adina, yes, you have to keep all those numbers. Luckily, we took pictures, so I could go back and count up the people at each event. So when I had to report out, and because of COVID, that kind of saved some grace, and we were able to extend out. But you have a partner or a lead person that helps you, even help you write the grant. I had someone to help me with that from their office. And also at the end, when we had to do the reporting, I had a partner and for reporting, and we were saying that we needed to go back because of COVID, and someone took one of our trees, so we had some leftover money. So yeah, someone came and took one of our trees. So we had to, the money is still out there because it was too late in the season to get the tree, and most of the trees were gone. So hopefully this year we'll be able to put that tree back. We planted it one weekend and they took it that weekend. It was on the corner, and because the trees are expensive, so it's like not a big giant tree, but a tree to put in our garden. And yes, and I think their application probably was about 10 or 15 pages.
Thank you, Adrian.
So Anne, I can also, just from a Presbyterian perspective, I have the privilege of knowing what a lot of churches have applied for grants for. So at the Presbytery level, because we have a number of grants through the commissions, our grants go to certain capital improvements to churches, certain programmatic, especially they're really for if you're starting a new program, but they're not intended to fund salary unless there is a very clear plan for how the church is going to sustain the salary moving forward. There is a Board of Pension supplement grant, but that's specifically for pastors who are part-time in churches that are working to make the pastor full-time. So basically it offsets the cost of the church dues to the Board of Pensions. There are grants through the Commission on Reconciliation for community engagement. So if there's a way that you want to engage with your community, you can go through them to do a community engagement grant. There are emergency building grants through the trustees. And there are emergency assistance grants for pastors through COM. So it's a really broad range of things that folks have applied for grants for within the Presbytery.
Great, thank you.
Suzanne.
Is there a time frame associated with grants as a rule? I mean, not only, like how long is it expected to last, that money, but also are there sometimes, or maybe always, end times, like you have to spend the money within a certain period of time, like a year?
That's a really good question. And it depends on the funder, but often yes. There are it will often say in your grant agreement, for example, that any money you don't spend by within a year, you have to give back, which is not a position you want to be in. Other funders, frankly, think that's more effort than it's worth. Thank you, Hannah. Think that's more effort than it's worth, but that is definitely something to keep a very careful eye on. I'm actually at my current non-presbytery job, we're running into a problem where we have 2 sub-organizations that had $300,000 grants each from us, essentially, that have spent something like $5,000 to $10,000 a piece for a program that's going to end in December. It's not a fun place for anyone to be in. So it gets again to the importance of not dollar chasing, essentially, because that's what happens. Really good question. I will also say I would expect at minimum to wait 3 months before hearing back from a funder after you submit a grant. With the exception of grants that are specifically for emergencies, grants are not good ways to get emergency funding. Grants are for your budget, for money you'll need to spend 3, 6, 12 months ahead of the time you're submitting it.
Can I make a couple other comments? Well, just sort of building on a couple of things people have said. One is that in terms of timeframes too, a lot of times, like, and I've seen this with the grants I've been looking at recently, they want to be sure that the grant is for something that's coming in the future. So it can't be for something you've done already. So if you know you want to get a grant for a particular project, don't start working on it just yet. That came up with some of these landscaping kind of things. The other thing is Adina, I emphasize what Adina said about not chasing money. And it also works when people come to you. Now, this is probably less of an issue for a church than maybe for some other nonprofits, but people decide they want to make a contribution and they want you to fund a particular program. You need to, if you're not going to be able to sustain that program after they give you the money, you need to turn it down, or you need to persuade them to do something else, because people get very excited about starting a program, but often they won't continue to give you the money to keep it going year after year. So.
Yep. Both excellent points, Lisa. Thank you. I think we have hit time, but thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I don't know, Jennifer, if you have any last words.
So I'll just say, so Adina is working with us through sort of April and maybe into May, and maybe possibly a little bit beyond that, depending on.
We'll stick with May.
Yeah, okay. And so if you have additional questions, to the extent that Adina is able to within her hours, she is committed to providing the presbytery, like the work she's doing is actually doing a really extensive review of our grant making process and the way that it's housed, and is helping us to rethink the way that it works. But to the extent that she is able, if there are questions that you have, I'm going to volunteer her to answer those for you.
Absolutely. And we also will be sending this out if it's as a reference, if that is helpful.
Yep. And if you didn't know this already, the Presbytery actually has a YouTube page, a YouTube channel. And so this goes up there. All of the elder training videos will be up on the YouTube channel. And I neglected to double check what the schedule is, but if I'm not mistaken, next month is going to be group dynamics and building trust in teams with Shannon Weston. I believe that is next. I could be wrong. So thank you all very much for being here tonight, and I look forward to seeing you next month.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone.